Good evening, good evening, good evening. This is Philosophy, Introduction to Philosophy at Free University Brighton. Hi, I'm Matt Lee, I'm the tutor here. This is Free University of Brighton course, Introduction to Philosophy, 2021. This course has River Forum for Free University of Brighton students. And the reading for each week is up there, and as I've mentioned before in these, it's kind of good to kind of read with this lecture. The whole point of these lectures is in a sense to sort of give you give you a way to sort of read some of these old philosophical texts, kind of give you a lay of the land and introduce you to them, hence Introduction to Philosophy. We're not going to be, in any of the cases, going into enormous detail. We could do in the future, and if you're interested in philosophy, then that's the sort of thing we could do. But this is an Introduction to Philosophy course for people who might be kind of wondering what it's about, wondering what philosophy is about, wondering whether they want to study a bit more detail, or just people involved in the study of philosophy want to sort of go over some basics. So this week we're going to talk about Nietzsche and this text on truth and lies in a non-moral sense. And it's worth just recapping what we've done. So we started by sort of giving an account of what we think philosophy might be, something that we might call kind of an analysis and study of the connections of the kind of way we think, or sometimes we might refer to that as conceptual engineering. We spoke about how philosophy has various different areas. We spoke about Descartes, and we introduced the rationalists and the empiricists, introducing David Hume to sort of stand in for the empiricists there. And then last week we spoke a little bit about moral theories, and 3 different moral theories that exist. And this last week I want to introduce Nietzsche, not because he's necessarily standard fare for an introduction to philosophy course. In many situations you wouldn't come across Nietzsche when you were doing an introduction course. He's kind of curiously odd in a way. Firstly, because of the way he writes, which in this text is actually fairly philosophical, but in other texts becomes, fairly easy to recognize as philosophy, let's say, in this text. But in other texts of his more famous texts, and the ones that were actually published, this one was never published. He didn't publish this, he didn't finish it. But in the ones he's actually published, in a lot of his other texts, his writing is quite curious, let's say, poetic, and allegorical almost, and doesn't immediately look like philosophy in many situations. And so Nietzsche is one of those people sort of at the margins, at the edges of philosophy, but who has a very, very big impact upon modern philosophical thought, and is kind of as important inside contemporary philosophy, or at least a large chunk of contemporary philosophy is at least as important as Freud and Marx. In fact, probably far more important than Freud or Marx. Inside a large chunk of philosophy, and generally speaking inside our cultural kind of sense of the realm of ideas, Nietzsche is a kind of big figure, whether it be in morality, whether it be in politics, whether it be in what we sometimes have called epistemology, or sort of notions of knowledge, how we know things. So Nietzsche is a kind of key figure, but he's kind of this complex figure because of the way he writes, and because of the way he kind of talks about stuff inside philosophy. And because of the way he undermines some very, very basic assumptions inside philosophy. So let's sort of begin there. What kind of basic assumptions might we be talking about? Well, one of the common assumptions that we might say, almost pre-exists, it's almost pre-philosophical, but one of the common assumptions that we might bring with us when we come to look at philosophy is that the intellect is a positive force. Now, not all of us are going to bring that assumption. Lots of us are going to have a kind of a different response to the intellect, but it's going to be a fairly common kind of assumption that in some sense using the intellect is a positive. That we're going to have disputes over how much, we're going to dispute where and when, and we might express these things in terms of saying that someone might be overthinking things, and so there's a kind of inbuilt awareness that too much intellect could be a bad thing, but generally speaking, we might sort of think of this idea of the intellect as a positive force as a kind of common assumption, even with certain limits. And one of the ways in which we encounter that, for example, and people who are studying, like we're doing here, we're studying the works of philosophers, one of the ways we might encounter that idea of intellect as a positive force is through the idea that we want to educate ourselves. So we might think that education itself is grounded on something like an idea of developing the intellect, even if we have limits and like restraints, and we're not kind of just going gung-ho, the intellect solves all problems. Just the very act of educating ourselves through study, through reading, talking and writing and listening and watching, through those modes of study around a particular common object, it looks like we're kind of developing our intellect. And education sort of looks like it depends upon this, or stands upon this ground, or this assumption. And so it would be odd, obviously, for most people if we were to kind of turn around and say the intellect is the great deceiver. It's the intellect that really causes you all of your problems. I mean, in fact, more problems than you could possibly sort of realise. This is a little bit of a distortion, but that's kind of what Nietzsche is saying. Kind of. It might not be the intellect itself that's the problem here, just it might be the way in which the intellect has to encounter the world. But that's kind of Nietzsche's claim, that the very kind of core assumptions underlying philosophical activity with regard to, let's say, the intellect, or let's say with regard to truth, the very core assumptions underlying philosophy, that these are kind of positives, are the assumptions that he kind of I wouldn't say, the assumptions he challenges. I was going to say inverts, but he doesn't quite invert them. But he definitely challenges them and asks us to rethink, in a sense, what we think we're doing when we're doing philosophy. And that's why it's good, I think, for an introduction course. If we can just use Nietzsche here, we're not trying to study Nietzsche in great detail. We're just trying to get a sense of Nietzsche's point that we need to be a bit careful when we engage in philosophy, because the very thing that's kind of pushing us to engage in philosophy might actually also be the same thing that's deceiving us. Now, this is a kind of strange thought, obviously, and it makes us perhaps think of a key philosophical concept that we'll come across throughout the years, and this is the one that we can call paradox. And there's various different ways in which we might come across paradox. There's it has cousins in a word called aporia, A-P-O-R-I-A, aporia, which kind of means no passage, no going through. So it has a kind of cousin in that word, and it has another cousin in the word contradiction. And so there's a kind of, the sense of paradox, aporia, contradiction, quite closely connected in family resemblances. But paradox is at the heart of philosophy in many ways. In the myth of Socrates, one of the founding myths of philosophy, after all, we find the Socratic Paradox, I know that I know nothing. And that's an odd statement, since the first element, if we're analysing it into parts, remember that's one of the things we try and do as philosophers, we try and analyse things. One of the first elements of that statement, I know that I know nothing, seems to cause confusion with regard to the second element. So the I know, the first part, seems to be in tension with the I know nothing. So this paradox, I know that I know nothing, we can kind of analyse them out, and we can kind of see that there's this tension, and in a sense this is or confusion, and in a sense this tension or confusion is what we mean by a paradox. Strictly speaking, paradox, kind of its etymology is thinking against common sense, paradoxa. Para against doxa, common sense. And so a paradox is something that you kind of counters or thinks against your common sense. And one of the more current classical examples, obviously, you might think of is Schrödinger's cat, which is a thought experiment inside physics, the results of which suggest that there's a cat in a box that's both alive and dead at the same time. And I don't want to get into Schrödinger's cat. You can go discuss that somewhere else if you want. That's fine. But that kind of idea that there's a cat in the box that's both alive and dead at the same time, this is the kind of core of paradox. Something which appears to be both itself and not itself at the same time is that which appears in paradox. So it's this kind of doubling of a relationship to reality, or a doubling of a relationship to existence. The thing sort of both is and is not. And in a clear sense, a paradox violates a central law of logic, or a central sort of sense of logic, but a central law in one sense, in which we might refer to Aristotle, who kind of put down this law that he called the Law of Non-Contradiction, which basically says a thing cannot be itself and its contradiction at the same time, i.e. it would make no sense to say something like alive and not alive at the same time, in the case of the cat in the box. And so there's lots of sort of issues around this, around whether we just rule out those kind of statements as, nonsensical. Just cross them out. We've made a mistake. Or whether quite often we might want to pay more attention to situations in which these paradoxical statements kind of arise, because there might be something else going on. And it's not easy to formulate the paradox that's at the heart of Nietzsche, and there's many ways of doing this, and so this is obviously just tentative, but one of the ways in which we might formulate the paradox at the heart of what Nietzsche is saying is in the following terms. Knowing more about something means not knowing more about something. So in other words, the way in which we learn actually kind of at the same time forms a blockage to the thing that we're learning about. So this, in terms of the intellect, in terms of like education, we might, think again about that notion of being over-educated or overthinking that some people might refer to, and the way in which that might detach you from reality or somehow closet you in ivory towers or something along these kind of lines. We're probably familiar to us in a certain extent with this kind of line of thought, and there's an element of that there, but generally speaking, when we say things like that, we kind of are saying something like there's been an unintended consequence. Someone's gone into education probably with the best of intents, and has kind of got caught up in the system, and now they're not really very very aware of things outside of their own little world. And we kind of see something a little bit along these kind of lines, this notion of an unintended consequence. We see something along these kind of lines when people refer to perhaps to science as something that might alienate us from the world, or when they kind of say something like science distorts our relationship to the world. They're kind of, there's a sense in which what's underneath that is not a sort of simple anti-scientific, all science is bad, return to religion kind of claim. That's not necessarily, I think, what people are kind of claiming there. But what they're sort of saying is that this particular way of educating yourself about the world actually produces certain blockages as well. You can't see the world in a different way that might be more creative or constructive. And in a sense, that's an unintended consequence. It's not one that's intended by the scientists. It's one that kind of results from the way in which they behave. And so there's a clear sense in which there's a lot of discussion about the kind of methods of thought that we might want to employ, the kind of ways in which we might want to think. But generally speaking, even when we think of those kind of things that we're criticizing there as something like, as I say, mistakes, unintended consequences, errors that can be corrected. Let's say that. Errors that could be corrected. And that's not enough for Nietzsche. We have to think, that we have to wonder about what if it's not an unintended consequence, but a necessary consequence. What if it's, in using the intellect, we necessarily deceived ourselves? Now, there's a really obvious issue here, which is how do we even tell if this were true? If our very intellect is the thing that's doing the deception, presumably one of the ways it carries out the act of deception is by making us think certain things are true, or enabling us to think certain things are true. So how would we ever be able to sort of disentangle, the actual thing that's true from the way in which our intellect is kind of making us believe something? So that notion of truth. Let's have a think about that. And this is what Nietzsche kind of focuses on, unsurprisingly, on truth and lies. In a non-moral sense, you might think, well, there's definitely some focus on truth here. So let's just start with a little bit of what's going on. And in order to do that, we're gonna look at the Nietzsche text. Now, ideally, I would love to spend a few weeks reading this text with people and going through it line by line and sort of really getting to grips with it. It's only 13 pages, and I think it's the kind of thing that people could have a lot of fun doing. Fun. I would have fun, but some people might. But we're going to look at the text a little bit, and as I say, obviously this could be done in a lot more depth. And let's just start with that opening line, which I've kind of highlighted there. Once upon a time, in some out-of-the-way corner of that universe which is dispersed into numberless twinkling solar systems, there was a star upon which clever beasts invented knowing. That was the most arrogant and mendacious minute of world history, but nevertheless it was only a minute. After nature had drawn a few breaths, the star cooled and congealed, and the clever beasts had to die. Now this kind of image that he begins with, this as he says, a fable that he begins with here, has as its purpose a kind of decentering. He wants to decenter these clever beasts that we are. He wants to decenter us and sort of enable us to step outside of the way in which we kind of think and organize our thought. And it goes on inside the text to sort of compare us with insects or other animals, and it talks about the way in which, from another's perspective, from a radically different perspective that's called nature here, but is looked at in a little bit more detail by Nietzsche in terms of other examples. In this radically different perspective, looking at us, as it were, from the outside, looking in at us, what we think of as meaningful, what we think of as reasonable, what we think of as true, all of this seems to be, impossible to ascribe to nature itself. Nature doesn't really have a thought about us. That's kind of what Nietzsche is saying. And it seems a bit odd then for us to think that our thoughts about ourselves are somehow accurate if the vast majority, everything else in existence essentially ignores us. And there's this kind of issue here about the way in which truth is Nietzsche poses as a human construct. It's a kind of a feature of the human. And when I say construct, I don't mean someone went out and made it up. What I mean is that it's kind of arisen like an emergent property out of this thing that is, the human being. And Nietzsche says in this essay, it's one of the things he'll go on about all the way through his work, this issue with truth. What he says in this essay, what then is truth? A movable host of metaphors, metonymies, and anthropomorphisms. So we all know what a metaphor is. A metonymy is a word standing for something else, like the crown for the monarchy. And anthropomorphisms, these are kind of the turning of something into a human. So the ascribing of feelings and thoughts to an animal is a kind of anthropomorphism. So what then is truth? A movable host of metaphors, metonymies, and anthropomorphisms. In short, a sum of human relations which have been poetically and rhetorically intensified, transferred and embellished, and which after long usage seem to a people fixed, canonical and binding. Truths are illusions which we have forgotten are illusions. They are metaphors that have become worn out and have been drained of sensuous force, coins which have lost their embossing and are now considered as metal and no longer as coins. So this, I think, speaks in some ways to Nietzsche's most difficult thought, his relationship to truth. But this particular emphasis in which essentially truth is a kind of a relationship of something like a metaphor that's become forgotten as a metaphor, a way of speaking that we take to be true but is in fact metaphorical, and we take to be true as a community, as a group. This speaks to something very, very important, which is that truth is, in a sense, a kind of a property that emerges out of relations amongst humans. This is exactly what he says. It's a sum of human relationships. And one of the things that's kind of crucial at this point is to then think, well, which comes first, truth or lie? Is a lie, something missing from a truth, or is truth something missing from a lie? Is there which is the primary concept here, truth or lie? And then the Nietzschean paradox is in the sense that it wants to say something like truth itself is untrue. that it is a truth which is both itself and not itself, as we mentioned earlier. And in this situation, the question of how do we tell the truth of the matter becomes one in which we can either offer positive response, so the rationalist or empiricist that we've looked at previously, they offer a positive response, or it becomes one in which we have to kind of change the way we're going to respond to the question. We're going to need a different reply from, the rationalist or the empiricist, perhaps. And the different reply might begin with something like accepting that we can't. In the face of the question, how do we tell the truth of the matter? Maybe we need to accept that we can't. Maybe we need to reject that question, but maybe not just reject that question. Maybe we need to not stop there, because, as I said, Nietzsche says the sum of all human relations. We can still use this idea that the truth is kind of used. And we might want to change the question from how can we tell the truth to something like what's the truth used for? Who is it that we think tells the truth? Where might we say, for example, in a situation, and comfortably say, without any kind of questions, where might we say comfortably that the truth is being spoken? What kind of person? Who is able to say that the truth is being spoken? What kind of person? What type of person? Now, these questions are asking us to kind of construct and think about the actual usage, situations in which truth is used. But in order to do that, it's also perhaps important to think about the situations in which lying is used. So here, I think it's a kind of here it's a kind of a step in which we need to perhaps try and have a thought that can be provocative. So the thought that's provocative is, if you like, the one that the kind of slogan that you can hang on to, the kind of thing that might need explaining, is that question of what a lie is. And it seems like we often think of lies as somehow the absence of truth. These things that are missing. Truth is somehow the starting point, and a lie is something that's the absence of truth, let's say. But what if we were to say instead, and this is to use sort of slightly technical language, that lying is the condition of reality of the experience of truth? Let's try and explain that a little bit more, just expand that. In other words, if you can't lie, you can't tell the truth. And in fact, lying comes first. It's only once you're able to lie that you can meaningfully tell the truth. And this kind of concept, and I mean, there might be different ways of thinking about it, but this kind of concept, this kind of way of us trying to think back to what must be the case for truth to be used, this is kind of one of the reasons that we want to try and think back into the uses of truth, those kind of situations about who uses truth, who decides, because we want to try and work out, as it were, once we encounter that game of using truth, what's gone on to set that game up. Now, one of the things that Nietzsche says, and we'll move along a little bit in the text, so let's just talk a little bit. Let's go down. Let's bring that down. I think we're nearly there. Let's just find a little bit for you. So, this is the quote I've just mentioned to you. What then is truth? A movable host of metaphors, metonymies, etc. This is on page 84 of the reading. And just after this, we have this question. Now, this is to carry on with Nietzsche. We still do not yet know where the drive for truth comes from. For so far we have heard only of the duty which society imposes in order to exist. Now, this is a kind of important definition of truth at this point. To be truthful means to employ the usual metaphors. Thus, to express it morally, this is the duty to lie according to a fixed convention, to lie with the herd and in a manner binding upon everyone. And this is kind of one of the cruxes of this article. So what Nietzsche sets up is this situation in which speaking and language arises, the use of speaking and language arises as a kind of negotiation, a kind of way of settling conflict. between different humans, and it kind of arises as this negotiation between humans. And one of the things that arises out of this is a kind of arbitrary agreement to call certain things by specific names: man, woman, up, down, whatever it is. But you attach a name to that, and then you kind of agree, convention. You don't agree formally, but you kind of all kind of agree that that's the name for that thing. But that name is a metaphor. It's not the thing itself. This is Nietzsche's kind of point about metaphor. That name is always a translation of physical inputs into this kind of other system of language. And it's a metaphor. Fundamentally, it's a metaphor. Fundamentally, it's a kind of translation from one system of physicalities, things and objects, if you like, into another system of subjects and, people and words and meanings. And in moving from one system, that kind of physical, to that, if we like, psychic or conscious system, that's the translation of metaphor. That's the movement of metaphor. So to be truthful means to employ the usual metaphors. This is what Nietzsche's arguing. In other words, it's as though we've got a set in our language, a set of terms that are stabilized and fixed metaphors, and another set of terms at the edges of those that are unstable and unfixed metaphors. And so every single part of language is metaphorical, but some of it's more stable than others. And the stable bits are what we call truth, and what we've conventionally come to call truth. So to be truthful means to employ the usual metaphors. And this employment of the usual metaphors is the duty to lie according to fixed convention. In other words, to allow that language and that fixity of language to be taken as though it were real and true, rather than some kind of arbitrary arrangement that's then been attached by convention to reality. Now, there's lots of difficulties here, and you can explore this in lots of different ways in terms of theories of meaning, theories of truth. But the kind of crux here, I think, to remember is this distinction between, terms that have become stabilized and terms that are still unstable. And truth is essentially the stabilized version, and in a sense, everything at first is a lie. Some of it then stabilizes and truth arises. And that's how lying comes before truth in Nietzsche. But then something else operates, which is once truth has kind of stabilized, once certain terms have stabilized in the world, then we encounter not just lying, not that kind of metaphorical, as it were, innocent lie. Now we encounter active and guilty lying in the form of the liar. And so the behavior of the liar isn't distinguished specifically by their failure to tell the truth. The behavior of the liar is distinguished by their use of the lie to deceive and to gain advantage from that deception. And so truth and lie become not about a kind of clean relationship between a word and a world. They instead become a much more messy relationship between deception and display of honesty, or deception and sincerity, let's say. And so the truth is not is it some sort of fixed thing. The truth is rather an attempt to speak without deceiving for your own personal use, and to lie is to attempt to speak with deception for your own personal use. And there's these kind of conflict that takes place there, and that Nietzsche thinks is the real core, coming out of this kind of struggle to agree, this struggle to sort of find a way to come to some sort of conventions and norms, and then seeing how that develops. And this is one of the reasons why this piece is called On Truth and Lies in a non-moral sense. He's not trying to ascribe at this point particular moral value judgments to truth or lies. He's rather trying to show what role it is that they're playing and what their use is. And this constant refrain I'm using of what's their use, how they're used, what kind of people use it, this is one of the ways in which Nietzsche connects with what we might call pragmatism, in which the meaning of things kind of arises out of their use rather than a kind of correspondence to reality or a coherence to other things that are being said. And these are sort of different ways in which we can sometimes encounter truth. So in this sense, I'm reading Nietzsche as what we might call a pragmatist. Now that first in kind of key bit, what is truth, and that kind of thought process in which we try and not dismiss truth, not throw truth out, but we try and rethink how we're going to conceptualize it in relationship to lying. That is kind of the key thing that Nietzsche is bringing into philosophy in a very fundamental way. And he develops it far more in other works, and this is just a particular piece that's often used to introduce Nietzsche, as it happens. But that relationship is one that he sort of brings to philosophy, and in bringing this kind of questioning of truth, he also brings in, as you might have noticed when I was reading that little bit from Nietzsche there, he also brings in this notion of drive. He also brings in this kind of dynamic that's pushing us or pushing the process, and that in a sense it's another kind of way in which, just like that image at the start of the piece, it's another kind of way in which he wants to decenter us. He wants to take us out of our complacent sort of self-centered approach to the world, in which everything kind of revolves around the human, everything seems to come out of us and we seem to be the center of the world, and he wants to decenter us. And in doing so, he thinks this kind of relationship to truth, poetry, creation, lies, illusion, these are kind of key ways of us both being more honest with ourselves and helping to decenter ourselves, helping to kind of, in a sense, lift ourselves out of our prejudices almost. It's a strange thing to say about Nietzsche, but I think it's kind of true. It's 30:30. It's 31. I'm going to pause for 5 minutes, so that will bring you to 7:36. Go and have a walk around, go and have a drink, do something to stretch and keep yourself going, and I will see you in 5 minutes. Sorry. Thank you, Tommaso, pointed that out. I'd forgotten to switch my mic back on. Okay, sorry about that. There we go. So what I was saying is, thank you for waiting around for that. What I was saying is yes, so Nietzsche's account of lying and truth, in which lying is kind of reorganized as more primary than truth, is combined with this this other second crucial element, which is forgetfulness, which is what he's saying here. So we still do not yet know where the drive for truth comes from, he says. For so far we have heard only of the duty which society imposes in order to exist. To be truthful means to employ the usual metaphors. Thus, to express it morally, this is the duty to lie according to a fixed convention, to lie with the herd and in a manner binding upon everyone. Now man, of course, forgets that this is the way things stand for him. This is crucial, this next move. Thus he lies in the manner indicated, unconsciously and in accordance with habits which are centuries old, and precisely by means of this unconsciousness and forgetfulness he arrives at his sense of truth. So this is the sort of second and fundamental element that we need to kind of take out in some sense from this essay. On the one hand, lying is being made, central, but lying with a kind of lying in a sense here is almost a synonym for language itself. Language is basically metaphor. Metaphor is a kind of lying. Therefore, this kind of making up of stuff, lying, is central. Some of that stuff that we make up becomes agreed and conventional and sort of stabilized. This is what we call truth. So it comes after the lying, after the sort of language lying process, metaphor process. We have this sort of stable core that we call truth, and there's an unstable periphery that isn't yet true. And then on top of that, there's now, once those sort of relationships between lying and truth have been established, there's now a kind of game that's played between people who want to use the conventions sincerely, and those who want to use the conventions dishonestly, to deceive. But they're all in a sense deceiving. Just some of them want to deceive in order to get something positive, and others want to deceive to sort of for self-interest. But and this kind of struggle between different people trying to use language to gain something sort of reaches an agreement. That's why some things stabilize out. We kind of agree to call things by certain names in order to, rather than having constant conflict over them. So on the one hand, there's that big chunk of this kind of inversion and change of the relationship between truth and lies. And on the other hand, there's this kind of other key moment in which that process that he's just described is at the same time unconscious. It's forgotten. It's habit of, as he calls it, the habit which are centuries old. And so what he's trying to do is, in this situation, this is a kind of theoretical framework in which he's trying to reveal something which by necessity is forgotten. It's kind of key part of his argument that this is not the way it obviously seems. And obviously one of the things he's trying to do, in a sense, is disrupt those usual metaphors and disrupt those conventions, and suggest that there's ways in which we might better sort of get, not behind, but we might better sort of get a different perspective on some of these. Remember again that image, that fable from the start where he's trying to decenter us. So this is all, in a sense, part of a strategy to sort of break us out of our comfortable habits, ease of thinking, the ways in which we kind of think we're doing the thinking, but in fact it's habits that are thinking through us. And so this element of forgetfulness is a kind of key, crucial accompaniment to this other element of kind of metaphor and lying being primary. And it's kind of interesting things to think about there, because he says, now man, of course, forgets that this is the way things stand for him. Now man, of course, forgets that we're using metaphors when we speak. Man, of course, forgets that we're kind of agreeing on some arbitrary convention. Man, of course, forgets that this is the way things stand, particularly when he's talking about truth. But there is a kind of question there in which, of course, really, without this second moment of forgetfulness, that of course kind of makes no sense, because we would, presumably if we were all hyper conscious of the fact that we were constantly making up these kind of arbitrary connections between words and worlds, language and things, we might want to sort of make those conventions better, or we might want to reorganize them, and so we might want to consciously deal with them. And this, I think, goes back to that idea that the intellect can be somehow kind of corrected when it makes unintended consequences. Because for Nietzsche, the capacity to bring this to consciousness is actually really problematic, and this is one of the reasons, and I think that this essay kind of never got finished by Nietzsche, because it kind of reaches this impasse in which the very purpose of this essay and this explanation kind of undermines itself. Now, one of these things that is one of these things that's sort of difficult at this point is trying to get at the sort of sense behind what Nietzsche is saying, as opposed to too easily thinking we can summarize his arguments. But I'm going to try and summarize his arguments a little bit, just to kind of finish off, so that we've got a sense of this, and it's again going through this kind of narrative. So I'm going to try and summarize what he's saying and give you a few page reference numbers so that you can look back at the pages. But remember that in this situation, this is a kind of experimental thinking, and we're trying to, as it were, recover what's interesting in the thought. And we can always find certain things that seem difficult, unsubstantiated, weird, and those things are important to note and point out and think about. And even something as simple as that phrase, of course, we might want to check back in the German and see what the translation was. It seems very off the cuff. Is it rhetorical? There's lots of ways in which we can explore the text, and as I say, that would be great to do it in something like a close reading, and people are more than welcome to sort of suggest that if they want. But it's also good for us to keep trying to when we're thinking about text like this, to keep trying to attempt to write something like summaries, paraphrases, so that we can kind of work through the ideas ourselves, and then we go back to the text and we sort of see that paraphrase missed a bit, and there's other bits that are interesting. And I've kind of gone the other way around in this section. I've tried to get that focus first on this kind of big shift, and then we can have this kind of summary. So here let's just run through the argument again. Or it might seem like for the first time, but it's basically again. So Nietzsche's argument sort of rests on what we might call 4 points. And it rests upon a model or a concept of language which has a number of features. So this is one of the first things to think about. What Nietzsche's focusing us on is language, and what language is and what it does and where it comes from and how it operates and how it might interfere with what we think we're doing when we're thinking and doing philosophy. So first of all, he argues, and just to summarize them, and then we'll look at them in a little bit more detail. First, he argues that the intellect develops as a power to deceive, as what he calls an art of dissimulation. This is on page 80 of this particular text. An art of dissimulation. Dissimulation is like a posh word for lying. An art of lying, an arting of making things seem not quite the way they are. And that the intellect develops, first of all, as this power to deceive. And we'll look at these points. I'll look at these little points in a little bit more detail. Just going to summarize them first. Second, he argues that there's no reason to think language developed in order to tell the truth. This is on page 81 to 82. And that seems kind of obvious once you say it, but a lot of people might think that the very notion of language is kind of communicative, and therefore, it's there to communicate, and therefore it has this inherent interest in telling the truth because that makes good communication, lack of error. But in fact, Nietzsche thinks that's not the case. There's no reason to think language developed in order to tell the truth. We might want to argue with him. Third, he argues that metaphor is what's central to language, and in fact that language itself is a kind of metaphorical activity. Now, there are lots of problems we might have with that, not least of which the opposite of metaphor is literal. And we might think, well, surely, again, with a communicative model in our head, language should be communicating as accurately as possible, as literally as possible, and the metaphor is a kind of negative here. Nietzsche's point, remember, and you don't have to agree with him. Nietzsche's point is it's the other way around. The metaphors come first, and then anything that's literal comes afterwards. Lies come first, and anything that's truth comes afterwards. And these truths and literalities and things that we think of as clean are actually just stabilized lies, stabilized fictions. And fourth, he claims that the drive toward the formation of metaphors is the fundamental human drive. And this is on page 88. So the intellect develops as an art of dissimulation, an art of telling lies, if you like. Think of hunting and trapping, the art of setting a trap, the cunning hunter set to trap. It's a kind of lie in the world, a dissimulation, which is why the word dissimulation, making things seem like they're not, why the word's that. So first, the intellect has the power to deceive. Second, language did not develop in order to tell the truth. Third, metaphor is what's central to language. And fourth, that this metaphorical drive is a fundamental human drive. So let's look at that first point. The intellect is a tool for deception in its origins. This rests on this argument that it's a means by which weaker people, or weaker humans, preserve themselves against the stronger. And in fact, he thinks of this as sort of more widely. It relies on a kind of naturalism. It relies on what we might sometimes think of as an evolutionary naturalism. It's kind of an evolutionary account. And here the intellect is a strategy developed in the midst of evolutionary struggle for existence, which bestows some advantage on those that develop it. And the advantage is in the face of physical superiority. The second point regarding the genesis of language, the idea that it doesn't begin to tell, in order to tell the truth or in some sort of communicative level, model. The second point regarding the genesis of language argues that language arises again as part of an evolutionary struggle, in particular as a kind of peace treaty in the face of violence. And then this stabilization is this peace treaty. And this is Nietzsche. This peace treaty brings in its wake something which appears to be the first step toward acquiring that puzzling truth drive. To wit, that which shall count as truth from now on is established. That is to say, a uniformly valid and binding designation is established for things, and this legislation of language likewise establishes the first laws of truth. You can find that on page 81. Now the third point is that language, remember, is fundamentally metaphorical, and that rests upon the idea that there's some kind of movement from nerve stimulus, what he calls nerve stimulus, what we might think of as like physical activity, if you like. And he argues that there's movement from nerve stimulus to image to concept. And at each step of this, there's construction, not translation. And we kind of adjust things that, to benefit us in a way as we move through. We're not a recording device. We're actually active in the way in which this translation from nerve stimulus to image to concept operates. We kind of have input into that. And the human, he thinks, is a genius of construction. He says this on page 85. But that construction doesn't have solid foundations like Descartes. Rather, he uses the phrase, rather, our constructions are built on running water. And for this reason, I think the best way of thinking about the constructions of language, and this actually refers to another philosopher, but we won't get into that at the moment, but the best way of thinking about language is something like a spider's web. And within the web of language, things are connected to each other, and if you pull on one strand, something else is going to happen. And the web itself is in some sense connected to the world. But there's a difference between being inside the web and that connection of the web to the world. Okay, and that's kind of what he's suggesting we need to think about a bit, I would say. And the fourth major point, last point, and this is kind of the key one that we're going to kind of finish on, is this metaphor drive. This is not really an argument, it's a claim he makes about human beings, but it's crucial to understand Nietzsche's model. He's not arguing that language is useless or that truth does not exist. It's not Nietzsche's nihilism, of language that would say that. Rather, he's arguing that that metaphor drive is forgotten. And as we begin to convert what we've created into what we call a fact, as we begin to convert, constructions that are freely made in some ways into impositions that we cannot avoid, and in so doing, in that conversion, in that drive, we convert a truth into a lie by making truth something it is not. And this occurs through this kind of process of forgetfulness. So this drive to metaphor pushes us to this level of creativity, but at the same time pushes some of those creations into this situation in which we take them to be external to us and imposing upon us. Now this aspect of forgetfulness is, let's having summarized a little bit of Nietzsche there, you can go back through that and have a quick look if you want. Having summarized some of that, this issue of forgetfulness is one that will connect in many ways with modern contemporary philosophy. And it's one of the most important shifts that occurs in contemporary or sometimes called post-Nietzschean philosophy. Whilst the major Enlightenment thinkers, Descartes and Hume, people like that, while they aim at clarity, and their arguments were aiming to increase that factor, to increase the level of clarity, Nietzsche thinks that in doing that, in aiming at that particular form of clarity, we forget that we've forgotten. We forget that there's a kind of forgetfulness inside language. And in particular, we've forgotten the origins of the intellect, of language and of truth. These kind of origins in evolutionary struggles. These origins in realms of behaviour rather than in realms of meaning. Let's say. And in particular, he thinks that we've forgotten the origins of the intellect, of language and truth that lie in the body rather than the intellect. And this is often a kind of big emphasis inside Nietzsche. He brings back in passions and the body. And so for him, that kind of archetypal claim of rationalist philosophy that, you need to be clear. You need to write clearly and sort of speak clearly and write things down as clearly as possible. For someone like Nietzsche, that clarity is a way of forgetting. It's a way of kind of carrying out this act of stabilizing things that are inherently unstable, and stabilizing them through what he calls conventions, basically through social agreements. And so clarity is a kind of imposition of an enforced agreement, that you must think this, you must think this way, you must agree with this. But forgetting that this isn't aiming towards the truth, but rather it's resulting from this kind of conflictual drives. Now we can also find this emphasis on forgetfulness, and this is one of the reasons it becomes so interesting in people like Freud. Obviously this notion of the unconscious that's mentioned here is something that is explored enormously in Freud, but we can also see this kind of odd relationship to forgetfulness in something like Marx, when he talks about the fetishism of the commodity. When he talks about the way in which objects that are made by human beings become something externalized to human beings, and this kind of process that Marx describes of labor under capitalism is a process in which, as it were, we are constantly forced to forget the extraction of surplus value that's at the heart of this particular process, and the kind of conditions for that, which are enclosure and disempowerment of what Marx calls the proletariat. So that kind of fetishism of commodity, that kind of way in which capitalism is able to make things appear natural, make things appear as though that's the way things are. That's again similar to what Nietzsche is kind of saying here. There's this, these processes of forgetfulness, and in Heidegger, we find in his works a kind of key sense in Being and Time, and in various of the works of what he calls the forgetfulness of being, laying at the heart of philosophy, a way in which philosophy is kind of too caught up with things like correctness and other kind of notions. And so this issue of forgetfulness, of thinking about what must have been the case for things to be like this, what must we have forgotten, what could we have forgotten, what might we have forgotten in the way things are, in terms of the way things developed into the way things are. This becomes a very kind of crucial element of contemporary philosophy. And what we find is that many thinkers in a kind of post-Nietzschean tradition, even if they're not Nietzscheans themselves, I'm not sure if I'm a Nietzschean, but I'm pretty, I like a lot of the things that Nietzsche enables me to think. But a lot of that kind of thought after Nietzsche has some kind of relationship to forgetfulness in it. It's not so that kind of work is not trying to pin down in clear statements how things are. Rather, it's trying to uncover in how things are what we've forgotten that made them able to be the way they were. Now that's a kind of strange way of putting it. So, we have to talk about that in the seminar a little bit more. Now, one of the things we can say though is that these kind of philosophical writing, it's not aimed in the same way as we might traditionally think it's not aimed at truth. Rather, people in that tradition often write in order to try and remember things that have been forgotten, or to try and offer accounts of why some things were forgotten and not others. Accounts that use notions like qui bono, who benefits, who is it that benefits, how to live in a situation where never forgetting would be something we were doing, whether that would be this kind of exploration of things that have been forgotten. So the writing of that kind of philosophy is, as I say, a kind of an attempt to remember things that have been forgotten, rather than necessarily an attempt to describe or pin down the truth. And it's in that kind of way, not that one method is opposed necessarily to the other, we can enrich and combine them in some sense, but it's in that kind of way that we need to begin to think about this thing that Nietzsche brings into philosophy, this attempt to recover the forgotten. Right. It's a kind of strange thing to end on, but as I say, if anyone particularly wants to study the Nietzsche in a bit more detail, I'd be definitely up for that. Happy to go through that. And if not, it's just the kind of text that's really useful to spend time with. It's only 13 pages. It's relatively short. You can get a good sense of it relatively quickly, by which I mean after about 5 or 6 hours of spending time with it. It's not that quick, obviously, but you can get a sense of the text. You can have read it 2 or 3 times, and I think it's a good one to study, and it's a good starting point. Having said that, it's worth remembering, just to give a warning, that it isn't a text he finished, and so it's one that is only an introduction to Nietzsche. But then this is an introduction to philosophy, so it's kind of appropriate here. Okay, that's all for today. Thank you very much. I'll see Free University Brighton students in River in a moment. And for the rest of you, I'm going to be back next week. I'm not talking about introduction to philosophy or anything like that. I'm just going to be talking a little bit more loosely in my research work, and I'm probably going to be talking about some of the Adam Curtis films. So if you're interested in that kind of stuff, have a natter. See you next week, maybe.